Let's hear it for Cameron Moll, everyone.
It is a thrill to be back on this stage. The last time I was on this stage about 4 years ago, I remember I presented, and then I left the stage and went just right out here, and there was an opportunity to chat with some of the speakers, and a gentleman by the name of Garrett Gee, whom would later become one of my good friends, came up to me. He was in college at the time. I think he was like 21, 22, something like that, and he showed me this app that he was working on. And later, about 3 years later, he appeared on ABC's Shark Tank, for those of you that have heard that, and they turned down his offer to take on an investment in his company, and about a year after that, he sold his app to Snapchat for $54 million. So you never know. I can't guarantee that's going to happen if you come talk to me after this event, but you never know what coming to an event like this might do for you and for your career. How many of you are from the New York area? How many of you have come in outside of the New York area? And how about outside of the United States? Terrific, just a few of you. Well, I guarantee that all of you have used one of these machines at some point, maybe dozens of times and maybe even hundreds of times. You know how this thing works. You put your cup underneath, you push the button, and the liquid comes out, right? So you know how this thing works. Even if you just push the water button, you know how this thing works. Have you ever used this machine before, though? Well, we bought our home about 6 years ago, and the home was built in 1986, and just about everything inside the home when we bought it was still in 1986. It was owned by an elderly couple, and the floors, the appliances, everything were stuck 3 decades prior. It was like walking into a time machine when you entered our house. And so over the course of the past several years, we've been replacing the flooring and the appliances and so forth. It is a game, and I kid you not, when someone comes over to use our fridge, because they approach our fridge expecting it to work the same way. And I'm not kidding when I say this happens every time. I had someone over at my house, a good friend of mine, just a couple months ago, and he kind of looked puzzled. He said, "How do you use this?" And I literally said this to him. I said, "Go for it." And sure enough, he pushes, he puts his cup under there, and the water goes onto the floor and what have you. Now, we could call this lots of things. We might call it intuition. We might call it muscle memory. We might call it a mental model. But I like to think of it as intuition, where previous experiences inform new experiences. And we use those previous experiences to guess how something new is going to work. And that's kind of the premise of what I will talk about today. Not so much taking experiences from other apps and applying it to your product or your app, but other experiences from your own product or app and applying it to different contexts, screens, interfaces, and so forth. To do this, I'm going to let Kevin Spacey introduce my remarks properly today. He's speaking at the Edinburgh International Television Festival. His show, as you know, appeared on Netflix exclusively, House of Cards. I think it's now in its 5th season. It's done remarkably well. I've never seen an episode, but I know it's done quite well. And he's talking about how these platform labels of TV and film may not apply to today's environment.
So I predict that in the next decade or two, any differentiation between these platforms will fall away. Is 13 hours watched as one cinematic whole really any different than a film? Do we define film as being something 2 hours or less? Surely it goes deeper than that. If you're watching a film on your television, is it no longer a film because you're not watching it in a theater? If you watch a TV show on your iPad, is it no longer a TV show? The device and the length are irrelevant. The labels are useless, except perhaps to agents and managers and lawyers who use these labels to conduct business deals. But for kids growing up now, there's no difference. Watching Avatar on an iPad or watching YouTube on a TV or watching Game of Thrones on their computer. It's all content. It's just story. And the audience has spoken. They want stories. They're dying for them. They're rooting for us to give them the right thing. And they will talk about it, binge on it, carry it with them on the bus and to the hairdresser, force it on their friends, tweet, blog, Facebook, make fan pages, silly GIFs, and God knows what else about it. Engage with it with a passion and an intimacy that a blockbuster movie could only dream of. And all we have to do is give it to them.
Yeah, that's much easier said than done, right? But that's why we're at an event like this. Now, I'll forgive Kevin Spacey for the pronunciation of GIF. But aside from that, his remarks are incredibly relevant to this audience. I mean, who knew how much information Kevin Spacey knew about what we do day in and day out? What he was talking about is this, right? Which one of these is TV? Is it the device or is it the material and the media? Well, I hope that throughout my presentation today, I'm able to persuade you to believe that the best interface is the one within reach, regardless of medium or platform, and to deliver experiences that cater to this. Now, as mentioned, I'm the founder of Authentic Jobs. This is a job board for people like us, all of us in this room, authenticjobs.com. And also, Oliver mentioned, I do these letterpress posters of buildings as if reimagined in type. This is the Brooklyn Bridge. You can see one of the arches, some of the wire. This is what it looks like at full size. I've done 4 subjects now, this being one of them. This one was done as a Kickstarter. I won't spend really any time, but I'll just mention this was done as a Kickstarter project. It was fairly successful in its funding, and we prepared the posters to ship out. We had shipped out, there were supposed to be, I think, 800 to go out, and we shipped about 400 of those. Had started shipping out just before Christmas a few years ago. I made the mistake of checking my email Christmas Eve at about 11 o'clock at night and got an email from someone who had received his poster and said to me, Cameron, I love your poster, but I just want to know if Brooklyn is misspelled on my poster or on everybody's posters. Do you notice that? It's hard to see. I mean, in fact, I have people have told me, I don't know how many people, but several dozen people have told me that they have this hanging in their office or at home and nobody ever notices this typo, even if you have them read the wording. There's something about the uppercasing and what have you. Well, long story short, it turned out okay. We ended up reprinting about half. It was a 1,500 limited edition run, so we reprinted half of them as the latter ones to be sold as corrected versions, and we kept the first half as typo versions, and we offered anybody who backed this project on Kickstarter the opportunity to swap for a corrected one, and very few people did. There's something about, I guess, having a typo version that makes it more special. One of the other things I'll share with you that I've done in my career was to write this book in 2007, Mobile Web Design. 2007, think about that. That's 9 years ago, a book on mobile web design. This was written before the first iPhone came out. In fact, it came out just a month before I published, and so I remember I waited in the Apple store in line and got a phone just so I could take a couple screenshots to put in my book. And not that I really had much to say about the iPhone. But I was trying to define the state of the web back then, and soon after that, it was, for a little while, it was kind of like this, where you had these convenient silos of being able to say, well, here you have mobile, and then iPad and other tablets came along, and here you have tablet. Since then, we've had this happen to where we now start asking the question, what are we talking about when we say mobile and tablet? We throw around these 3 terms, mobile, tablet, and desktop, to mean something, and they do, like Kevin Spacey said, in the minds of those of us working on these kinds of things. But really, what do they mean? When we say mobile, where does that line divide, especially in the center? Well, responsive web design came along, as you all know, and it was like, you know what, forget about screen size. Who cares about screen size? Let's develop our product to work for any of those screen sizes. And we've seen how that's played out, especially outside of the more developed countries. If you look at Africa and Asia, they rely on 96% of interactions with web content through a browser. So for them, apps are very minimal. Obviously, responsive web design plays a very important role depending on the number of screens that they have, the sizes and so forth. If you look at the United States, it's flipped. We rely pretty heavily on apps, even though sometimes we really screw up with our apps. Here's Greg Hoy saying, the CNN iOS app is so bad, I took the unprecedented steps of deleting it and reinstalling it just so I could delete it again. Now, let me stop at this point and say, if there is anyone from the CNN web team here, I'm confident, this was 2 years ago, Greg would have good things to say about you. I would have plenty of good things to say about you. And I think that applies for everybody in this room. I'm going to use some examples today. Some of you, given previous times that I've given this presentation, might be working on the products that I show. If that's the case, know that we're all in this together. I'm going to show some of my mistakes that I've made today to kind of level the playing field so that if I do mention your product, you don't feel bad, but we have an opportunity to learn from it. That being said, I'm going to take one more minute to just poke a little more fun at CNN. When I installed this app for the first time several months ago, once you get through the terms and allowing location services and so forth, you come to this screen. I was like, no way. It says, play This Is CNN audio on application launch. And there's a toggle to turn that on and off. I'm like, are you serious?
This is CNN.
Now, I still didn't, I'm like, there's no way this is going to play every time I open the app. So I open up the app, and I shut down the app, and I'm like, all right, let's test this out. Is this really going to play every time I open the app?
This is CNN.
Wouldn't that be rad? Now, unfortunately, this feature is no longer in the app. Yeah, you can't view this anymore. However, I did hear from, when I spoke about this last year, someone came up to me and said, Cameron, it used to be that toggle didn't exist. So whenever you open the app, period, if you use the app, you got to hear James Earl Jones every single time. Now, we poke fun at those developing apps, but those of us developing for the web don't do a lot better sometimes, right? This is like the typical mobile web. You navigate to the site, you got the modal pop-up, the native app offer, the bottom and top banner. And we say, haha, that's funny, but then we look at things like this that actually do that very thing. And we wonder, are we getting it right too for those of us developing the web? Well, I think we know that screens at this point are ubiquitous. This is St. Peter's Square at the announcement of a new pope in 2005 and then again in 2013. And we can see just how far we've come. And with all of those screens around us, we start doing some kind of weird things, although this may not be that weird for some of you. 49%, this is a study that Google did, and they found as part of that study that 49% of multi-screen users email themselves a link for continuing an activity on another device. Does anyone else here do this? Okay, good. I'm not the only one. And in fact, there's only one app still today, and I've used this example for about 2 years. There's only one app still today that recognizes that I do this a lot. It's called JotNot. It's basically a scanning app where you can scan a document. And once you set it up once, there's an option that shows up when you go to export that file. That's email to myself. Don't have to do anything to set that up. After that, just tap that, and boom, I'm done. Now, in this next screenshot, if you'll please ignore the fact that my phone calls me Pumpkin. Bit of a story to that. If you're an iOS user, there's an extension called Mail to Self where you can replicate this across not just one app, but Safari and lots of other apps. And I think there's a feature that's been in iOS for a little while called, I think it's called Handoff, maybe. And I'm sure there's some similar things on Android that allow you to do that very thing. Of course, if you're on iOS, there's AirDrop, but who knows if that's actually going to work when you wake up on that given day. Now, if we celebrate responsive design strengths and accomplishments, I think it's fair to acknowledge its shortcomings and its weaknesses. And one of those is the fact that responsive web design ends where the browser ends. The fact that it has a W in it is inherently suggesting that this is for the web, and inherently, because of that, in general terms, through the browser. So if our rally cry is, let's make it work everywhere, then we need something that goes beyond just the browser and unifies all of the touch points that our users have. Not just one device, but many devices, not just through the browser, but in apps, and so on and so forth. As an example of this, if you use Facebook, not necessarily the Oculus, but if you use Facebook, and you access Facebook beyond a large screen, so you use it on a smartphone or something like that, how many of you use the app versus how many of you access it through a browser? Raise your hand if you go to facebook.com and you're on your smartphone through the browser. How many of you go to the app? And that's pretty indicative not just of a tech audience, but most people as well. My mother would use the app over the browser. And so if all of our eggs are in the responsive web design basket, we might be missing a very significant portion of our audience, certainly in the more developed countries, that prefers to have that content through an app rather than through a browser. Now, here's mistake number one from me. We don't today, we used to, but don't have an app for authentic jobs. That's a known weak point for us. There's some history there as to why we had one and now we don't. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that it wasn't being used. It was a technical matter in some of the development team that we had in place. And we recognize that that is a weak point for us. But that being said, if we look at mobile, it's difficult to say what we're talking about when we say the actual word mobile. So we like mobile, tablet, desktop, right? But what do we mean when we say mobile? Are we talking about the noun, the physical object, something like the Samsung Galaxy Note 8, which is either the largest phone in the world or a tablet that also functions as a phone? I mean, is this mobile? Is that what we call this thing? How about this is an Acer desktop? They no longer manufacture this, but I'll tell you something about that in just a second. This is a 22-inch touch screen that runs on Android. Where do we classify this thing in that spectrum of desktop, tablet, and mobile? Now, I said they no longer manufacture this, but Alphabet, the parent company of Google, recently announced that they're merging the Chrome OS for larger screen operating systems with the Android OS in 2017. So we're probably going to see more things like this coming next year. When you talk about mobile, are we talking about the verb, the act of being mobile? We might say that this individual is mobile because it looks like he's on the go. He's got a small screen device. How about this? Is this mobile? This is Joel Glovier. He's sitting in the passenger seat of his car on a laptop, probably using a personal hotspot. So where do we classify this in that spectrum of things? Same thing here. I mean, it looks like he's sitting at an office desk, but he's on a small screen device. Well, in that same study that Google did, they found that 77% of us use home or work locations to do mobile searches. So again, it mixes up. What are we talking about when we say mobile? And then finally, the adjective, the capabilities, the camera, the GPS, the Touch ID, and so forth. I love this photo because I think it so perfectly represents how global this is, right? And he's using the adjective portion of that, the camera built into that small device. Or signing in with your face. I don't normally sign in like this, but if you were to sign in with your face recognition through USAA, they do some tremendous things, by the way, for banks and technology. I love being able to bank with USAA. But I guess one hit against this is the fact that I can only do this on my mobile, a small screen device. I cannot do this on my laptop. Even though my laptop has a camera, it could very well replicate the same thing. I don't understand why this only applies to a small screen device and not allowing me to do the same thing on my laptop. So what are we talking about when we say mobile? What parts of speech, for that matter, are we talking about? I love eBay and the fact that this is John Donahoe, who I think used to be, I think he's been replaced, and may have moved over to PayPal or something like that. But he had mentioned in an interview with Charlie Rose a few years ago, he said, we just looked at mobile as another screen. That's all it was to us. And later in that interview, he says, Charlie, we are selling 8,000 cars a week through mobile experiences. I think this was in 2013, which would have seemed a little crazy back then, not as crazy today, but eBay understood that mobile was just another screen. It wasn't this small device that only had limited capabilities or only could do GPS and things like that. So maybe we need to be talking about smallish screens when we talk about mobile, and maybe we need to take screen entirely out of the conversation, because what happens when you have something like this, the Amazon Echo, which doesn't even have a screen, but interacts through audio commands. It has some mobile-like capabilities, voice recognition, among others. And this might be, getting back to what I said at the start, this might be the screen, the interface within reach. And what happens if we try to leverage that and take advantage of that with our products? So the nouns, the verbs, the adjectives, all of those things we just talked about, they're all converging. And because of this, we know that your audience wants unified experiences. They're dying for it, like Kevin Spacey said. They're rooting for us to give it to them. And if we give it to them, they might make those crazy gifts that will make us very happy to see our work. This is my youngest son, by the way. I don't know how we captured this. We got lucky to capture him going, yeah. Now, Adobe recognized this with Lightroom. If you're familiar with Lightroom, it's a very intense app for editing photos, and they recently introduced Lightroom. You can see it on Android here. Lightroom for mobile. But I think even they made this mistake of saying, well, it's just a small screen, so they'll only want a limited set of features. Stu Mashwich, who happens to be a cinematographer, used this app as he walked around Oakland, took some beautiful photos. And in this same tweet conversation, he says, replies to this person, he says, you know, Adobe Lightroom for mobile is still not enough for what I did to these shots. It desperately needs user presets and local adjustments. That's desktop terminology that he's using, saying, I'm dying, I'm rooting for Adobe to give me these things in a smaller screen experience. Facebook Messenger recognized this. In the press release in January, they said of the new version, this is a cross-platform experience, so you can pick up where you left off, whether you're on a desktop computer, a tablet, or your phone. I'd like for the Facebook Messenger team to talk to the Facebook Ads team, because they also released a recent update to their app, but kind of made the mistake again of saying, nobody wants to do that on a small screen, except when users chime in and say, everything I've tried to do can only be done from a desktop. This app isn't very helpful. I saw this just a few weeks ago with Twitter, where I was on the OS, the desktop client. I leave my DMs open to anybody who wants to contact me, and that opens yourself up to spam, as you probably know. A message came through, and I'm like, okay, I know I can flag this, and so I tapped the menu, the ellipsis, and these are the only two options I got. Where in my mind, I was like, well, you know, I'd used a soda machine elsewhere, to go back to that metaphor. I've used this through the browser on the desktop, and I know that I can do that. And so I had to exit the app, go into the browser, tap that same menu, and then I was presented with one more option to be able to flag that conversation. Why in the world I couldn't do that in the app just confused the heck out of me. So maybe, just maybe, when we talk about responsive web design, and let me just say too, you will hear other things on this stage about responsive web design today. Please do not take my remarks as a hit against responsive web design. We need responsive web design, but we need that in addition to some of the other stuff that I'll be talking about over the next 20 minutes or so that I have left. So how do we build on responsive web design? Well, I think we start possibly by taking the W out and recognize that we're really talking about responsive design in its truest form, where something will respond to a wide variety of adaptations and not necessarily just within a browser. And so that brings me to what I'm talking about today, unified design, unified UX, whatever you want to call it. I'm not interested in introducing a new term, by the way. If this happens to take off, great, but I don't care about that. I am just using this as a framework for talking about what I'm talking about today, unified design. I really think that this is the next frontier of the next few years and what will take us to where we need to go, regardless of whatever it ends up being called. But it's this idea of presenting a cohesive experience to our users, regardless of where the experience begins, where it continues, and where it ends. And the goal is a unified whole. It's not mindlessly cloning from one screen to the next, but stepping back and saying, what is the holistic user experience for someone who might have several screens and might start on their laptop at work and finish that transaction in bed on a phone? I have used this example before, and if we had time, we would debate whether this is a great example of unified design or a horrific example of unified design. And I'll tell you why. This is the original Southwest Airlines website from 1996. The idea being that if you wanted to make a reservation, you'd tap on the phone up here to make a reservation. And if you wanted to read something from Herb Keller, the CEO, you'd tap on his face and so on and so forth. Now, I'm actually on middle ground as far as this is concerned. And I'll tell you why. This could either be a horrific example of unified design where you're just mindlessly cloning something, or it could be a terrific example of unified design, certainly back in the time where if you were coming to an airline website in 1996, chances are you probably had never been on an airline's website in 1996. And so maybe making it a familiar experience, kind of like the soda machine, to where it was familiar and almost intuitive, maybe that was a great thing. I don't know. But I think it's interesting to look back at time and say, look back in time and ask that question. Is this what we need to be doing? Well, when I think about unified design, there are two facets to me that are most important. By the way, all of this will be in my slides that you will be receiving from the event. So if you'd rather not write any of this, great. And if you'd rather not write any of it because it's not helpful, I apologize. Come talk to me in the hall, and hopefully I can make your app successful to the tune of millions of dollars. We'll see if I can make up for it. Form and function with emphasis on the and data symmetry. If we look at first form and function, I think for those of us that have been trained classically in design, not myself, but for those of you that have had training you might say, well, function over form, right? I mean, that's the typical argument that we always make. But I would ask you, is that really the right argument to be making? Bruce Lawson, who also speaks about similar topics, I think he gave his father a phone, an Android phone, for Christmas a few years ago, and this is the first time he'd ever had a phone like that. And he watched his father use this phone for the first time. Let me read just a few of his remarks. He said, when a site looked radically different for him, he'd check the URL bar to ensure that he typed in the right address. In short, he found responsive web design to be confusing, and it meant that he didn't trust the site. So for Bruce's dad, a lack of not just unified function, but unified form as well, led to this first-time jarring experience for him. Now, when I thought about what parallels have we seen in history to these kinds of things, one that comes to mind for me is the history of the Coca-Cola glass bottle, that iconic contour bottle. In the early, I think it was the 1920s, Coca-Cola was the leading soft drink of the day, and so they were facing an influx of competitors. So they issued, heaven forbid, a design contest to bring new designs to Coca-Cola that would satisfy one requirement among others, but one primary requirement, and that is that the bottle had to be recognizable in the dark. So if you were to reach for a Coca-Cola in complete darkness, you would know that you were holding and reaching for a Coca-Cola. And that's what we have today. This bottle that has stood for many decades since then stands because of a focus on form just as much as function. Function was easy. I mean, they had the function part figured out pretty easily, but the form part became integral to that experience. So really, when we talk about this, and I think a lot of other things, we might need to talk about function and form as equal partners in this mix. Look at what Amazon does, right? We've probably all used Amazon. For me, this is the archetype of unified design. If I have something in my cart, I'm signed in on a larger screen, I pull that up on a tablet, on a mobile device. It doesn't matter what size screen, as long as I'm signed in, I'm going to see that same data in my cart, my wish lists, and so forth. Gmail, another great example. You've seen this metaphor of these stacked messages for a very long time. And in fact, this goes back to when I wrote that book. In 2007, look, it's right there. This is a screenshot on a Nokia 6680, that metaphor, that visual metaphor of unifying the form that you might be used to on the desktop still existed 9 years ago. This is what Authentic Jobs looked like just until about 2 months ago. There's actually quite a bit of interaction involved in filtering jobs for location, job type, skills, and so forth. And we had been working on a redesign for about 1.5 years. And the whole point of that redesign, not the whole point, but the primary point of that redesign was to make anything available on a large screen also be available on a small screen, in addition to updating the paint, so to speak. Now, you probably know that if you are developing something that's content heavy, like a brochure site, a blog, something like that, responsive web design is a joy to work with. If you're developing anything moderately complex or heavily complex, maybe like a job site, you know that it can be maddening at times. And for us, it was maddening along that course. And so we started looking at other people that have tackled moderately complex filtering and that sort of thing before. And one of those is MusicBed. By the way, if you ever need music for a video, a film, or something like that, terrific resource for that sort of thing. And we're like, you know what, these guys have some of the same filtering as us. You see it along the left and across the top. Surely they've figured out how to do this on smaller screens using responsive web design. So I remember one day I pulled up their website on my phone, and this is what I saw. This is the homepage. You can get the app, you can open the app, or start a chat. And that was the extent of it. So as we looked at other examples, Rdio, by the way, the now defunct Rdio, we did the same thing, looked at Rdio. You could access that in a web browser on a large screen, and it worked beautifully, but as soon as you pulled it up on your phone, if you remember, you could only download the app from the homepage. Well, somehow we managed, I think, largely because of Adam Spooner, who's my front-end developer, to pull this off where nearly all, I think all of it, if I'm not mistaken, all of that same functionality and a lot of the form carries over from any screen device that you happen to be on. And by the way, I'm happy to report, and this is the case for a few other examples you'll see today, because I've been talking about this for almost 2 years now, it's been great to see products begin to leverage unified design. MusicBed, if you go there today, this is what you'll see. You'll see a lot of the filtering that before you couldn't get to. Now it's there. Now it's a present thing. So the second point, second facet of unified design, data symmetry. This involves the repetition, the continuity, the synchronicity of data across screens and platforms. More than 40% of online users in the US start an activity on one device and then finish on another. If you've used Spotify, you know that there is not just sequential symmetry, like we talked about with Amazon, where you go from one screen to the next on a different device or different screen, but there's also synchronous symmetry, where you have things like if you're listening to Spotify on a desktop computer and you pull up Spotify on your phone, it will ask you, do you want to listen on this phone? Do you want to control that other instance? And this isn't happening over Wi-Fi. This is happening through the product that they do this. Zappos, not a great example. They've improved since then in that time I've been giving this presentation. If you were signed in on Zappos, had items in your cart, and you went to a different screen of any kind, and you were signed in, it would show nothing there. And that's because all of their data was cookie-based rather than being account-based. I remember I was working on this presentation once, and I pulled up this email from them that said, you've got 2 items in your cart. And I'm like, all right, I'll take the bait. So I tap Proceed to Cart. Of course, I get the interstitial ad saying you need to download our app. I skipped that. And when I got there, there was nothing in my cart, even though I signed in. And they were saying, you have 2 items in your cart. Well, thankfully, since then, they have unified things. Not so much aesthetically. This is the browser version of that. This is the app version of Zappos. But if you're signed in, you'll get all of that same data. And you might say, well, Cameron, I never go to Zappos through my browser on my mobile device. I just use the app, so why does it matter? And I would say to you, well, let's look at that email that I just got. Chances are, if you open up that email, you're probably going first to the website rather than to the app. And is that going to be a jarring experience for you, depending on where things are located and what the aesthetics look like? And in comparison, Amazon does a pretty terrific job of having those two, both function and form, be in sync with each other. So to wrap up, let me give you 8 best practices that I think are emerging for not only creating unified experiences, but for talking about this amongst our teams. Number 1, unify your internet presence, not just your web presence. There's a difference here, because when you use an app on your phone, you're not necessarily using the web, but you are certainly using the internet, if that app connects to the internet. Web, as you know, involves, generally speaking, HTTP protocol and a browser. So if we're thinking only in terms of unifying our web presence, we're missing the other spectrum of apps and things like that that might use the internet but may not use the web. To give you an example of this, if you look at the 5 products across Apple's website or store, only 3 of those have a browser. The other 2 do not. And so what happens if all of our focus is only on the browser? Do we miss those other opportunities? So when Luke W., a good friend of mine, who talks about mobile first, I think we need to talk about unity first, because that's partly what he's saying is this very thing. Let's start with the core. When he says mobile first, he means really let's start with the core product. And I agree with that completely. But I'm saying let's get away from a little bit talking about the terms of mobile, tablet, and desktop, and talk about unifying all of those things, irrespective of how we each define each one of those silos. Number 2, treat every facet of the user experience as a contributor to unity. The list is very long. If you step back and look at your product, there's copy, there's tone, there's iconography, there's visuals, there's placement, flow, account data, identification, you name it. Across the board, there's just so many different things. And I love the fact that MailChimp does a great job of unifying their content across any platform, across any screen, right? Talking about Bro Freddy, there's a casual tone in some places. It's not the casual tone that MailChimp does well. It is the recognizing that human-to-human communication exists everywhere in its app and making that a focus. So if it's on the branding page, it might be cool to talk about Bro Freddy, but if you're checking out and your credit card fails, it's probably not going to be that great to have Bro Freddy come up and say, ha, your card failed. But recognizing that there's maybe a human-to-human way to communicate how that card failed. And that's the unified approach that they take. You know, you might say, well, Cameron, this is just branding. My response to you is, yes, branding is the origin of unity. It is the genesis of unity, but I don't think it's enough. I think branding, if you look at its history, is autocratic. One governing body that will set the tone for that product. Whereas today we have kind of this, for lack of a better word, I made this up, we have the kind of like this duocratic relationship where the users and or their devices are determining what our brand becomes when it shows up and renders on that device. And so we have to relegate, we have to give up some of that branding to them and to their device for the sake of creating a more unified experience. And I really, as I said at the start, I think unified design is the next frontier of branding, and for that matter, maybe for responsive web design and mobile first, and building on those things. Number 3, consider web views when developing your native app. Luke Mathis wrote a brief but terrific article where he said in it, he says, you're already using web apps in native wrappers without even noticing it. The fact that nobody even notices, the fact that this is not a story, shows that when it comes to user experience, web versus native doesn't matter anymore. Web views essentially allow you to generate HTML content inside a wrapper. Back when I wrote the book, we called these smart clients, where the app would render the navigation bar or something like that, and then the rest was rendered through the web. If you've used, I haven't been able to confirm, but the Amazon app, they're most likely using web views to be able to unify things. How many of you use Slack, by the way? Okay, quite a few of you. You're familiar with web views. You can hit Command-R, if you're on an Apple, in the Slack desktop app, and it will refresh the screen, in part because it's running basically, even though it has a wrapper, it's running most of that through the web, through HTML. Now, I said consider. I said that intentionally because it may not be right for you. There have been other articles written about this where Slack's pretty darn large, but some other ones as well have found that web views just doesn't work for them, so it may not work for you. Number 4, unify actions, not just content. I've hammered on this already in my remarks, but here's another way of saying it. Josh Clark says, sync verbs, not just nouns. So not just content across devices, but actions too. Facebook, I love Facebook. They do a great job in many regards of what I'm talking about today. This is one area where they kind of fail. So if you have ever authored a post and you want to attribute a person or an individual, you can do that. But if you want to do that for a company, like I tried to do when I was writing this post, this is the night before we went live. What was the day of? No, okay, night before. We went live with the new Authentic Jobs, and I was writing basically just a journal entry of sorts. And I wanted to credit our Authentic Jobs Facebook page, and I could not do that. I was in bed. I was kind of writing this from my phone, and I could credit my wife Suzanne and Miles, one of the guys that worked on it, but I couldn't credit Authentic Jobs. So I had to get out of bed, go get my laptop, and I knew I could do it there. Now, that's a small issue, right? But to what extent do we ignore the best interface being the one within reach for our users and force them to take silly steps like this just to be able to do something that should work on that same screen or on that same interface? Number 5, we talked about this too. Store session data in the cloud, not locally. Avoid using browser cookies to store, for example, shopping cart data, because those cookies are specific to that device, specific to that browser. We ran into this, another mistake that we made. Here I was talking about this topic on stage, and I get back a week or so later, and we got this email from one of our users that said, I have a job listing in my cart, however, when my boss tried to pay for it, he can't see it. We're using the same login. I'm like, are you kidding me? Here, this whole time, I thought Authentic Jobs was unified in this respect, that if you were signed in on one instance, same account, and signed in elsewhere, that job data would show a job listing in draft mode, for example, and it did not. Come to find out, guess what we were using? We were using cookies to store that posting data and not storing it in the account. Thankfully, we've fixed that since then. Number 6, replace click with tap or press. I try to do this when I'm talking with team members, but certainly when we try to write copy for users. What's amazing to me is that for about 3 decades now, the perfect description for interacting with hyperlinks has been right under our noses. How appropriate is it that for 3 decades plus, when you hover over a hyperlink, your cursor changes to a pointer? How cool is that? And yet still today, when we talk about this action, we use the sound that our mouse makes to describe it when many people might not be using a mouse to tap on that link. Now you say, well, that's a silly, you're nitpicking semantics. Well, I'm sure I am, but if you look at something like this, if I pull up this WordPress email that says, please click this button to reset your password, that's fine on a large screen, but what happens here? Granted, most people might understand what click means at this point, right? But could we use something better here? Could we say, please tap or press this button? Number 7, replace mobile with small, smallish, whatever you want to call it, something that might get you thinking beyond, this is a perfect screen of this size with these capabilities. In fact, no kidding, I've done this a lot with my PSDs or my sketch files or even in Basecamp or Slack discussions. I tend to use the Jackson 5 when I talk about our file naming. So Michael's the little small guy, right? So that's the small version of the rendering. Jermaine's somewhere in the middle, so that's the tablet-ish size version, and so forth. I mean, this is done jokingly, but it's also to get us to force us to think beyond tablet, desktop, and mobile as these perfect silos that really no longer exist. And number 8, eliminate big screen bloat. As an industry, we still struggle with this incredibly. We still believe we have this, I think, and I'm included in this, we think it's okay to trim on mobile and yet not do the same on the desktop. If, here's Luke W., he overheard someone saying, screw this, the mobile version's so much easier. Maybe he was talking about Authentic Jobs, the previous version, that individual, because before, you could not locate yourself, listings near you, on a big screen rendering of Authentic Jobs. But there was a trick that if you wanted to be able to do that, because we had built that in for smaller screens, all you had to do, okay, so you can see the location there, all you had to do was actually shrink your browser, and then right here in the middle, this Locate Me button would show up. And then I could locate myself. And then I could stretch my screen back out and keep doing what I was doing. That's because we thought nobody's going to want to do that on a big screen device. This was 2011, so understandably, this feature wasn't as well supported back then. But sometimes we do this kind of thing. eBay is guilty of this as well. If you want to contact a seller to purchase this awesome Vanilla Ice signed photo with MC Hammer, you have to get through 3 taps. You got to jump through a couple radio buttons and whatnot to be able to contact the seller. But if you have the app open, it's 1 tap, and boom, the form shows up, and off you go. And this isn't even that bad. Have you ever tried to reserve an Apple Store Genius Bar appointment from a large screen device and had to jump through this hoop? I can't believe that it requires, when I say taps, that's not just tapping on something, but that could be full page renderings to get where you're going. If you use the Apple Store app instead, it's 1 tap to be able to make that same appointment. I don't understand why we still think it's okay to do this when we've already accepted that it's okay to do that. I think we need to think about both of those in both contexts. So, if I've convinced you to at least begin thinking or believing that the best interface is the one within reach, then it allows us to believe this principle, that the best user experience assumes that every interface is the one within reach. Thank you so much for your attention today.